are anxiously awaiting the live stream.
Oh, excellent.
Okay.
Good luck today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's my pleasure to welcome today people who are countering the IMF week, World Bank week trend of ignoring trade issues. Actually, that's one of the reasons we're very grateful to Dr. Catherine Mann and the OECD for doing this event. The divide between people who focus on trade and macro outcomes remains true in research, while in reality, of course, we are seeing every day the importance of global supply chains, trade finance, and other nitty-gritty issues of real-world trade having real macroeconomic effects. Obviously, the official sector, starting with the OECD, but also the IMF and others, have begun to realize this. At Jackson Hole this summer, we even had the spectacle of ECB President Mario Draghi talking against protectionism. This is all good, but also at the same time, it just ups the demand for high-quality research that makes these linkages clear, empirically estimates them, traces them through. We're proud to have colleagues here at the Peterson Institute trying to do that, and we are very proud to have interactions with the OECD Economics Department, where they, of course, are leading some of the world's work on this area. It's also a personal pleasure to welcome back Catherine Mann to the Peterson Institute. As some of you are aware, she was a senior fellow and then non-resident senior fellow at the Institute from 1997 to 2011. She and I got here at roughly the same time. She did an enormously influential book for the Institute on Is the U.S. Trade Deficit Sustainable, as well as far ahead of their time work, including with Jacob Kierkegaard, on financial linkages in trade and services issues that were ahead of their time. Dr. Mann, of course, was Rosenberg Professor of Global Finance at Brandeis University before taking up the post of Chief Economist and Head of the Economics Department at the OECD, where she is completing a 3-year term of public service. And may I say, Catherine, the extent to which you got that large bureaucracy, talented but bureaucratic, to produce good and relevant work over the last 3 years is striking, and we thank you for that. Previously to all that, she had various appointments, including working for Stan Fisher at the Vice President for Development Economics at the World Bank, and 13 years at the Federal Reserve Board before leaving for the Peterson Institute. We're going to have comments on her discussion today and her presentation of her and her OECD colleagues' research by Dr. Chad Bown, who is a star of stage and screen, but has been a senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute since April of last year. I am proud that Chad is one of our hires in the recent years. He's been a terrific colleague, but of course he's also been at the absolute forefront of both research and public debate over issues of international law, trade sanctions, not sanctions literally, but enforcement issues in trade, global supply chains. He previously served as senior economist for international trade and investment at the White House, the CEA, and as a lead economist at the World Bank, where he led a lot of their most interesting applied work on trade and research. Prior to that, he was actually a colleague of Catherine's as a tenured professor at Brandeis. We are very happy to keep ripping off as many good people from good institutions as we can. Send your resumes when you are ready. Joking aside, this is a substantively rich area of research, and the two people we have speaking for it and their colleagues and co-authors are at the forefront of this, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. Catherine, welcome back.
Well, I'm, of course, delighted to be back here at Peterson. I really did do
quite a bit of work here, and I continue to be able to go back to that work and say, how much has changed and how much hasn't changed, which is one of the things that's challenging about policy these days, is how much still needs to change. So what I'm going to do today is weave together a number of the research papers that have been coming out of the OECD on issues regarding trade. And I'm also going to show you some of the data that are available and some of the questions that are still out there that are worthy of further research. So there's a little bit of salesmanship of what's going on at the OECD right now, but also a little bit of what I'd like to present for other people to continue on with the work using some lenses of data that I think haven't been well exploited and can certainly do a better job of furthering the research agenda. So the issue with trade, of course, is these three elements. Trade is an important input to productivity growth. Trade presents challenges with regard to reallocation, and trade is also a factor in some of the concerns that we have over equity or inequality. So I'm going to be weaving these three together. Down. There we go, down. Okay, so background. We're going to do background and in terms of the change of what's going on with a changing landscape. So the first issue is that we've got a shift in specialization patterns and growth in trade. So this is something we all know, but just because I think it's a background that's useful for some of the additional material that's coming along. On the left-hand side, we've got the trade in goods only, and we can see the shift in 1995 through 2015 of the share of goods trade associated with or coming from the advanced countries in the OECD, that's the blue. And so we know that there's been a shift away from the advanced economies towards the emerging markets, but what is also the case is that from the inner donut to the outer donut, there's been about a 5 times increase in the volume of trade. So when we think about the challenges of adjustment, it is still the case that there's plenty of jobs and trade to go around because of the expanding donut, even if the share of the donut going to the OECD economies is smaller. Now, on the right-hand panel, what you're showing here is that the growth rate of the manufactured goods, which is in the green, has kind of tempered off, and the new markets in financial services and in business services are increasing. So how does that translate into this, into what's happening to firms in product space? So this diagram shows some of the most recent work that we've been doing to understand the way in which changing comparative advantage and changing patterns of complexity affect the degree of competition for firms in the advanced economies. So what we have here is the share of exports by different degree of complexity. The red bar shows the lowest complexity, in other words, sort of crayons, and the blue bars show the more complex products, think of medical equipment. And you've got 2 time periods, 2015, 2000 and 2015. And so the story that everybody is familiar with is that China, the dynamic Asian economies, have increased the complexity of the products that they sell into the global marketplace. That we see as the blue bars going from being small to being kind of tall. On the other hand, looking at the advanced economies, Europe, Japan, and the United States as examples, they already have exported the most complex products. And if you look at Japan, for example, they have increased the degree of complexity in their product set. If we look at the overall span of complexity of products, indeed, there's competition coming from the emerging markets that is affecting the sort of the heightened competition for firms in the advanced country marketplace. But what actually matters more for the degree of competition facing firms in the complex products in advanced economies, they are competing more with each other. That part of that complexity, they're being pushed up from the emerging markets, but the degree of competition amongst advanced economies is actually higher and is more important for the competition amongst firms in the advanced economies. What this translates into from the standpoint of how the market responds, well, this is an area for further research. Is one of the reasons why we're seeing mergers and acquisitions among firms in the most advanced parts of the product space in advanced economies, is the reason for that because they have heightened competition with their advanced country peers. And so that's one question that we are pursuing in taking what is now this, which is now data, and taking that to the next level, which was how is this enhanced competition among the advanced country firms in the most complex product space translating into other dimensions of what's going on in the market. A second area of research that we've been involved with is looking at the importance of services as an adjunct to manufacturing competitiveness. And so what we've done with this is using our TIVA data set, or the inter-country IO matrices, which is two different pieces of the puzzle, is to look at the importance of different kinds of services as a part of manufacturing exports, so services value added in manufacturing exports. And you can see again a set of countries there. This is not the full set, there's a lot more, but there are three different kinds of services that are important in this space. And one is in-house services. That's already things that are embodied in the firms that are producing manufactured goods. And then there is so-called domestic outsourcing. That's that middle bar that's in sort of the peach-colored. That is, think of it as a domestic value chain where the services have been outsourced from the firm, but they are still in the domestic economy. And then the third element being offshore of services, which are the ones that now have moved offshore. Now, the point is that as a percent of export value, you can see that these services value added in manufacturing exports is very, very large. Above 50% basically for everyone. So the key ingredient, the key question here is how, and I'm going to get to this in the policy discussion, is how does service sector liberalization, which is a key element for both the trade side, the external flows, how does that service sector regulation or restrictions affect export competitiveness? So it's behind the border as well as across the border, that service liberalization can play a key role when we're thinking about adjustment. I'm just putting this up here to give you an idea of what data that we have, and also because we'll be talking a little bit about policies with related to digital trade. This is just a correlation that shows that countries that are more connected trade more with each other. So it's a very simple chart, and just to give you, as I say, give you an idea of what data are available for your own work that might be related to digital trade. Now, global value chains have been an important ingredient in understanding kind of the new nature of trade and how different parts of an economies relate to each other. So we have a couple different ways that we look at global value chains. I showed you the one with services as an input to the manufacturing products. This is another way of looking at global value chains. It's this eigenvector centrality. And the value of looking at things this way is that, first, it's a cool chart, and you can kind of see which is a hub, in other words, lots of spokes. So the hubs are the big circles, and then the spokes are the trade relationships between the different countries, with the width of the relationship being the amount of trade. And you can see that we're looking at a very large number of trade flows, 34 sectors, 62 economies, HS6 level, so you get 4.5 million flows. So it's a very large amount of data that is used to generate what is something that we know from Richard Baldwin's work, that we've got a Europe hub, a US hub, and an Asia hub. So a couple of the things that you can do with this type of analysis is respond to the question of, do you have to be a hub in order to get the productivity benefits of trade? Or is it okay if you're a spoke? And the answer there is, it doesn't matter. that the trade benefits in terms of productivity growth come whether you're a hub or a spoke. And I think that's an important new insight when we think about global value chains. The second issue that comes out of looking at GVCs this way, and all of the data and the research associated with it, is how does the directionality of trade matter? Does it matter? And the answer is yes, that if you are a domestic firm forwardly linked to a multinational, you get a productivity benefit from being part of that relationship. On the other hand, if you are a domestic firm and you are buying from a multinational, you do not necessarily get a productivity benefit. Now, that calls into question whether or not it's the buying from the multinational that is the issue that inhibits productivity growth, or more explicitly, the business environment in which the firm in the domestic economy operates. That can be the place where, even though you're buying from a high-quality multinational, if you are existing in an environment where the domestic economy is not conducive to higher-level productivity growth, then all of the gains that you might get from being part of a GVC is actually eroded away by the characteristics of the domestic economy. That's a hypothesis that needs additional work, but based on other research that we have, that's a suggestion. The third, or maybe the fourth issue that one can do with looking at these GVCs, marrying it up with our firm-level data that we have by different firm size, is we can ask the question, who gets the biggest benefit from engaging with global value chains, either as a hub or as a spoke? And that is smaller firms that are further away from frontier productivity. So this says something about how to change policy so as to enable firms to engage, smaller firms in your economy, to engage more deeply with multinationals. And we know that some of the service sector regulation, which I'll point out, stands in the way of making that happen. So we can do other things with these kinds of charts, these kinds of data. I'm just going to show you these very quickly to give you an idea, again, of how you can deploy this particular methodology to understand things like what might be the employment consequences of changes in the global value networks. They're called global value chains, but they really are networks. This is an example of how IT manufacturing moved over time from 1995 to 2011. So all of the red hubs there lost participation in global value chains and presumably lost some employment as a consequence, and all the green ones are the ones who gained. Now, you can look at this, as I say, you've got about 36 sectors that you could look at in order to evaluate what the employment consequences might be of these kinds of movements in the hub of a global value chain. Gives us a lot of insight into where the adjustment costs and the reallocation challenges might come from associated with these kinds of movements. As I say, this is just an example of IT manufacturing. Now, we also have services in this data set, and this is an example, again, using this lens of IT. What do we see when we look at the services GVCs? First you see there's almost no red anywhere. It's all green, meaning that production employment trade associated with IT services has increased everywhere. But the other thing that you can see there is how the extent to which there aren't a lot of huge bubbles. They're kind of smallish bubbles, meaning that there aren't really hubs when it comes to global value chains for IT services. They're well distributed around the world. And that, again, gives us some insights as to where competitiveness may be important and where employment might be generated. Now, I've given you a lot of information about how GVCs have been changing, but let's go to the macro level and look at two different data sets that we have for global value chains over time. So look at the time dimensionality. It is aggregated, but the time dimensionality is important. On the left-hand side, we have this new data set, GVC Nowcast, which is something that is available online. It's available through 2014. Now, this is important because 2011 is the last data set that we have for the full TIVA data, and we won't have another data set for another couple of years. And people want to know kind of what's happening to the global value chain on the aggregate basis. And so this is what we can offer you. And the observation, of course, is that global value chains, from a nowcast perspective, going through 2014, has started to taper down. The growth rate or the intensification of global value chains has tended to temper down. Now, we also have something that we call our real-time indicator, which does not use quite as advanced a intercountry IO matrix in order to generate the picture, but it does use intermediates, and we can see that the real-time indicator follows the nowcast indicator, and both of those follow our benchmark indicator. And the key point, again, is to show on the right-hand side the extent to which global value chains, in fact, have unraveled. So whether the intensification of fragmentation has tempered out, according to nowcast, or actually unraveled, you can see in the real time. The point is that all of the gains that we've been able to identify coming from global value chain participation, whether as hub or spoke, small firms getting more benefits, outward and forward linkage being more beneficial than backward linkages, that when this fragmentation starts to retreat, we're going to have a problem with regards to all of the gains that we've been able to identify with regard to global value chains, which, as I say, they're technology transfers, economies of scale, cluster economies to the extent that it's a domestic value chain, and productivity growth as an outcome. So I'm going to show you this next chart, and I'm just showing you this because it gives you the range of countries. It gives you the 4 data points for each country, 95, 2008, 2014. And you can also see to which extent countries have had the most erosion of participation in global value chains. It's in Asia. And the question then going forward is, and there's more work that needs to be done on this. I'm just showing you this so that you can see what kind of research you might want to, research questions you might want to address using these data, that how much does the unraveling of a global value chain in a particular region, what are the implications of that for that region in terms of its productivity potential, in terms of the need for the economies to use an alternative source of economic growth and productivity growth in order to enhance its economic well-being. So we put all this together and we come out with trade integration process has stalled. And so this is our trade intensity, world exports plus imports to GDP. You can look at it as growth rate to growth rates, which you get a similar picture, but trade intensity and trade integration process has stalled. Now, some people would probably say this is a good thing, but I would argue for all of the reasons that I put forward for why GVC integration has been very beneficial, that it's not a good thing to have the trade integration process to be stalled. So I'd like to turn now to add in some looking at the adjustment issues. I've already sort of suggested that there are some ways to look at adjustment challenges by looking at some of these other indicators on trade that I've already put forward. But the real question is, when we're talking about adjustment challenges, many people are responding to the globalization backlash and have made that globalization backlash focused on adjustments that come on the trade dimension. And I'm going to argue that the trade dimension is really not the most important dimension for the challenges. The challenges are extremely real, but to demonize trade is to and potentially focus on policies associated with trade is going to miss the problem that needs to be addressed by policymakers when we talk about adjustment challenges. So this is an example of a decomposition. We always have these exercises where we try to do a decomposition of what are the major sources of challenges to manufacturing job loss or job loss in general. This is an example of manufacturing job loss, which is in the triangles in black, which are all below the zero line. And then the fact that there are services growth rate in jobs, which is in the red dot, is, it's an offset, but it does mean that there's a transition between manufacturing to services, and that's part of the adjustment challenge. But again, the question is about globalization backlash. Do we demonize trade, have our policies focus on trade, or do we look at globalization in a broader context and say, what are the reasons for why we have manufacturing job loss? And so there are three that are potential, and of course they're all related, but I think they're important to parse them out because not all of them are about trade. And so the three elements here are about trade, technology, and I call them tastes to be alliterative. But what tastes are is changes in consumer preferences. In advanced economies, our consumer preference basket has shifted away from manufactured products towards services. That's part of the, Engel curves. First it was agriculture, then manufacturing. Now we're onto services as being the principal component of our consumption basket. And so it should be no surprise that changes in consumer preferences are an important ingredient in manufacturing job loss. Technology is one that is well recognized. So if we look at these example economies, and this is, we could do this for more, but this is enough, the bottom line coming out of this chart is that the green part of the bars, which are a combination of technology and consumer preferences, is driving manufacturing job loss. Those green part of the bars is much bigger than the blue part of the bars, and blue is the trade part of manufacturing job change. And within the blue, the observation is imports of intermediates, which is associated with global value chain participation. Those actually augment manufacturing jobs. So being part of the global value chain augments manufacturing jobs, whereas imports for final consumption, that's where we have to deal with the adjustment as imports substitute for domestic production. So the issue here is if you're going to demonize trade, it should be just for imports or final consumption. But if you're going to take a broader perspective on what the adjustment challenges that are facing your economy and facing workers and firms in the economy, then you've got to take this perspective about what's happening to technology and consumer preferences. So this job polarization chart, I'm sure everybody's familiar with, so I'm going to skip it because I want to be able to give plenty of time to Chad. Now, a dimensionality of the adjustment challenge that is worthy of additional consideration and work, both on a research basis but also on a policy basis, is the fact that the concentration of production matters. So if we look at an economy and we look at how production of both goods and services is distributed throughout an economy, we know that it's not distributed equally. Production of goods and services are not distributed equally around an economy. And we can measure the extent to which production of manufactured products is concentrated in certain regions relative to the production of services. And so using our regional database, we're able to show that that there is a differential between the regions that have concentrated employment and firms in manufacturing, which is in the measured by the triangles, versus the regions that have more distributed set of jobs, which is, in this case, the distributive trades. What we don't have on this diagram, and really should, is business services and financial services. Those would be somewhat different in terms of, between the two of these, in terms of the degree of concentration. So there's a lot of cross-country variation in this database, and then there's a lot of, there's a way of mapping firm-level data into these regional databases, which we've done for some of our economies, to get a really clear picture of how shocks are going to affect different sectors in different regions. And this is important because we know that there is this picture is basically telling us there's heterogeneity in the composition of employment by regions. We also know there's heterogeneity in the types of shocks that are hitting an economy. We can call them trade shocks, we can call them technology shocks, we can call them consumer preference shocks. So if we have heterogeneity in regional employment and production and heterogeneous shocks, then we know we're going to have heterogeneous outcomes in terms of adjustment challenges. And knowing that and thinking seriously about what that means is and should be an important ingredient to the policy discussion that countries have. Now, if we put together the job loss, which is the horizontal axis, and regional income data, we have a negative correlation. In other words, the concentration, the relatively higher concentration of manufacturing jobs in regions is associated with widening disparities in regional outcomes with regard to income. And so that is part of our, part of the story that other people have told with regard to electoral outcomes. Now, we haven't done that work. It goes beyond our mandate, but of course other people have. So what are we going to do about all of this? Let's talk a little bit about policy. So let's start with what not to do. What not to do is we've done exercises about what rolling back trade liberalization might do. So we did an exercise with our Metro model, which incorporates the global value chains. It incorporates the different sectors, including services. And we've done an exercise of rolling back the trade liberalization that's been done since the Uruguay round. And the loss to GDP in the countries that are imposing the restrictions, which are in blue, which is the US, China, and Europe, is about 2% of GDP. I would also note that this is a 10% rollback of trade liberalization, so it's effectively a 10% increase in trade costs. That 10% increase in trade costs would be associated with a 15% loss in US exports. So that tells you something about the cascading effect through global value chains for the US economy of a rise in trade costs. Now, there is collateral damage to the rest of the world that is not involved in this tit-for-tat trade scenario. That's in green, and that's 0.5% to global GDP. So I emphasized services liberalization, the role that it plays in global value chain, the role that it plays in the rising proportion or the rising growth rate of global trade and the rising proportion of global trade that's associated with services. This is our database for the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. It's a compilation of quite a range of different indicators of both domestic as well, so domestic behind the border, as well as border restrictions, and across a different set of service sectors, which you can see in the bottom horizontal axis. So you see the range of the restrictiveness. This is from the highest restrictiveness by country to the lowest, 44 countries. And it's pretty current, 2016. And then there's the mean in there, which is about a little bit more than 0.2, which is, it's an indicator that goes from 0 to 1. Now, the 0.2 is going to be important because I'm going to use that later. But anyway, you can see there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to services restrictiveness. So what do you get out of it if you actually do an exercise of reducing services barriers? Well, let's ask first, let's look on the right-hand side and ask first, on whose shoulders does these services barriers rest, and how expensive are they? So the right-hand panel shows you for different size firms what the issue is, or what the consequence is, of having a STRI score of 0.2. That was that average that I showed you in the previous diagram. So a 0.2 STRI restrictiveness translates into a tariff or tax equivalent of about 15 or 12% for small firms engaging in trade. So it represents an additional tax to them. It is even more important, almost 25%, a little bit more than 25%, makes a 25% tax on small firms participating in multinational global value chains. So going back to the very beginning, on that eigenvalue centrality exercise, I said how important participation was for small firms. This would help them get towards the frontier in terms of productivity growth. One of the things that stands in the way is participating with a global value chain or directly exporting is this STRI, Services Trade Restrictiveness. If you're a big company, on the right-hand side of the chart, turnover of 200 million, not a big deal, although it's not zero either. On the left-hand side, what you can see is what would be the impact on a particular industry. So we're using autos here, but you could use some other sector if you wanted to, of an improvement, quote, quote, impact of halving the distance to the lowest STRI. Okay, so that's just your exercise. On which of the types of services trade restrictiveness is most important in terms of holding back participation in the manufacture and export of automobiles. And you can see that some of these, like the road transport, that's expensive, but even some of these other ones having to do with banking, third from the left, or computer services, third from the right. These are still important ingredients, and having services trade that is restrictive in these areas can have negative implications for the for firms' competitiveness in international marketplace. I'm going to skip the next one. And we talked a little bit about that picture about the relationship between data and external trade. And I wanted to bring to your attention this set of data that we have just put together on different kinds of data regulation. I think this is a particularly important issue because this is now a very hot topic. And you can see the different kinds of data regulation that can be put into place. One having to do with cross-border data transfers, different kinds of issues related to data transfer, meaning not allowing it at all, having various conditions and so forth. On the left-hand side, you can see the significant rise. And then on the right-hand side, a different type of data regulation, which is often required on a consequence from privacy regulations, is local storage requirements. Now, on the one hand, we can say that cross-border data transfer restrictions have tempered off at a very high level, but the local storage requirements seem to be continuing to rise. So again, this is information that might be useful in pursuing a research agenda associated with data flows. Just putting this all together, we had a reduction in trade integration. We've got an unraveling of global value chains. We've got a variety of services trade restrictiveness that are particularly pernicious for participating in global value chains, especially for smaller firms. And we have regional concentration and adjustment issues. So there's a lot of factors that are underlying this globalization backlash that could be interpreted as, what are the costs of having this turn away from globalization? Well, one way to do this is to do the reverse exercise and to say, well, what if trade integration and participation in global value chains and reduction in services trade restrictiveness, what if those had all continued apace during that time period when trade integration was most rapid in '86 to 2007, before it started to flatten off? What would have happened to productivity if we had continued to deeply integrate more broadly across services as well as goods? And what you can see is over a longer term exercise, we've got an increase in productivity of about 0.2%, productivity growth, about 0.2 percentage points. That's the red in the far right. Now, that doesn't seem like a whole lot. except when you look at the productivity growth that we've had, which is in the middle bar, where we are right now, where productivity growth rate on average is at about 0.45. So adding 0.2 to that augments by almost 50%. So the loss, so more deeply integrating to the extent that we had in the past, could add a lot to our productivity growth, and we know that that's an issue that we have to address. So if we put all this together, that we've got adjustment costs and that we've got challenges that are for productivity growth and deepening engagement, we come up with an integrated policy agenda, 3 elements. The first is, at the international level, having everybody play by the same rules. This is with regard to, for example, SOE financing, or with regard to labor standards, and there's a lot that needs to be done with regard to making the international system fairer and to work better. But the bottom line is, even if the international playing field was completely level, you would still have adjustment coming from changes in consumer preferences and changing in technology. So the top of the triangle is only the tip of the iceberg. And what we really need to focus on is how to manage the adjustment that's coming from this panoply of adjustment challenges. And those are 2 elements. The first, on the left-hand side, are the ones that we've been talking about for a very long time, the national policies that are designed to engage firms, that they can enter and exit, that we can have productivity growth, business dynamism, all that kind of stuff, job creation. But the right-hand side of the triangle, this is now an area that is very challenging for economists and for policymakers, because the story about heterogeneous regions and heterogeneous shocks points us to having to deal with heterogeneous policy responses. Targeted policies, are they for regions? Are they for people? Do we talk about mobility? Do we talk about bringing infrastructure to regions that are left behind? We know that our policies in regard to regional efforts generally have been really poorly administered and had poor outcomes. But we can't ignore the fact that this is the locus of the biggest policy, the biggest concern, and we have to figure out a way of doing regional policy or targeted policies. We have to figure out how to do that better if we're going to deal with the adjustment issues, and so we can get back on track with the type of deep trade integration that is associated with higher productivity growth. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Mann. So let me, before I get started in my formal remarks, just echo a number of points that Adam said. It's incredibly valuable for the international system to have Dr. Mann in her current position right now as heading up the OECD team of very capable and excellent researchers working on these key issues. I have known her for a long time. She has been one of my personal and intellectual heroes, introducing me both to a lot of these issues, but also then how to engage publicly on them. So if you hear me slip into a very informal reference to Kathy's work, that's not out of disrespect, but out of my affinity toward to her efforts in this area. So let me say a couple of, one other leadoff point. I think it's also incredibly refreshing for us here in Washington in the United States to be confronted with this bevy of research right now. Because right now, this is not at all what we are focused on and what we're talking about. We are in the minutia of renegotiating deals and sort of going backward in time. And I think it's very, very important to recognize that this is what the rest of the world is doing. This is where the actual real world issues are. And by the United States doing a lot of backward looking navel gazing at the moment is really missing out on what the core and important policy challenges are that we are ultimately going to be confronted with and that we're going to have to one day catch up on. So thank you to continue, for you and your team to continue to pursue this agenda and to keep it going while we're sort of dealing with something else right here. Okay. I wanted to kind of bring three main points, questions, I think ultimately that Dr. Mann, Kathy talked about in her presentation. Some of it to push back on a little bit. Some of it is maybe suggestions for additional work that the OECD could be doing in this area. And the 3 points have to do with the cross-border supply chains and this interesting question about, is there retrenchment going on? Is there a reversal or not? The second is the international policy agenda, what the recommendations are coming out of that, but then also what the OECD's work program is and how they might be contributing to that and could make additional contributions. And then finally, the third is on the domestic policy agenda and adjustment and what we can learn from some of the OECD's work here. Okay, so the first point is on global value chains, cross-border supply chains, and the work that the OECD has been engaging on this. The first point I want to make is, again, to highlight the incredible contribution that they had made just in terms of data collection and provision. So one of the big challenges that we face in this area in international research is national data sets are only in, for the most part, gross flow terms. To understand supply chains, we need to understand input-output relationships between upstream and downstream suppliers. Once you look beyond the national level and you try to make comparisons, it's really, really hard because nations have different types of data structures and input-out. So the OECD, through this trade and value-added TIVA database, has done an incredible service to the world to provide a harmonized system to begin to allow us to engage in research on this issue. So it's very, very important, and it's a huge resource, and I would invite researchers out there to go and access it and use it for their own work. I'm also very intrigued by these recent results that you're putting out on the potential retrenchment of some of these global value chains and in these nowcasting, I think, results that are very, very interesting. I'm not sure I believe it yet, so let me push back a little bit, but I think it definitely signals that we need more work in this area. So there is, I think, to my mind, a big question about whether we're seeing a reversal of value chains, or a retrenchment, a reshoring, or really it's just slowing down. And so to this point, I will point not to my own research, but to my research, or to the research of my colleague here at Peterson, Carolyn Freund, both through some work that she did last year in our reality check, but also a more recent paper where she's kind of explored some of these themes. And it's hard to disentangle, certainly. But it seems like a lot of what seems to be going on could just be in terms of the trade slowdown over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, to just being a slowdown of global growth. This is explaining a big chunk of that. So that's what we'd like to obviously better understand before we conclude that there seems to be reversals of supply chain activity. Now, that being said, it is still worth thinking about if there would be reversals or even a slowing down, what the potential implications of that would be, especially for policy. And so what I'm going to do here is to think not in terms of data, but in terms of anecdotes. And so this is, worthy of obviously further research and pursuing. But, if you recall this Foxconn announcement of not too long ago that they're building a big plant in Wisconsin. And so there may be, if we think through this, there could potentially be some activity and trade foregone. Things that we used to the United States might have imported from China, East Asia in the past, may now be being produced in a plant here in Wisconsin. Okay, fine. That being said, my understanding of this investment, while it's a large investment, there are not a lot of jobs associated with it. And to the extent that there are American jobs associated with it, this is not sort of low-skilled assembly jobs. It's the very skilled IT folks that know how to write software code and to turn the robots on and to make sure that they function. But if that is actually going to lead, potentially, that kind of investment to a change in supply chain activity, so you could imagine perhaps now there's a lot less of the assembly of iPhones or something like that that would have taken place before in China and East Asia, that could be a substantial disruption globally to the net number of jobs associated with this kind of activity. And it's certainly the kind of thing that's worth thinking through and exploring and working on in terms of research. So I highlight the need for us to really dig into that and to understand it better, because it could have profound implications. My second point is highlighting the critical importance that Kathy's work identified on the international policy agenda of what priorities should be. So I think I agree first and foremost of her slide that shows what we should not be doing, right? Which is we should not be reversing the liberalization gains that we have had over the previous, really 7 decades. That was heading in the right direction, and reversing that would have profound implications, many of which I don't think we fully even understand yet, since we're still grappling with the complexity of these supply chains. But then on the positive agenda side, and she didn't spend much time on this, there are still gains to be had out there through additional services liberalization, trade facilitation, rules to prevent data localization, all the stuff that we were talking about not that long ago in the American context in terms of TPP and TTIP. And we'll see what ultimately happens if these things would survive a negotiation in the U.S. NAFTA context. But I agree with her that those are important policy priority areas. I guess I missed the bullet point that you had there on a policy priority should focus on bilateral trade balances. So I guess that's not one that should be on the agenda. Okay, good. I'm glad we're on the same page there. It seems to be talking a lot about that in Washington here, but. But one point that I thought was perhaps lacking from the international agenda sufficiently, and I'm not sure really how to deal with this, but I see this as actually one of the major sticking points of our current time, and this is the difficulty that we're having right now, the West, the market-oriented economies, and China, and how to think about this. Now, I understand the OECD's mandate, and it has difficulty in having complete freedom to do what it would like. But it seems to me that this is an area of conflict that we need to wrap our head around to better understand where the true conflicts between market economies and non-market economies are and where they aren't. So you mentioned SOE finance. I'll point to some indicators here. Again, not my own research, but Carolyn Freund has done a really interesting work over the last couple of months showing that in terms of the global concentration of industry, it seemed to decline over time, except in a few key sectors. And those key sectors are ones dominated especially by Chinese SOEs. And those are some of the ones now that are generating some of the international conflict in metals, for example, steel and aluminum, that are really sort of over-focusing the global debate. So what could an OECD thing do to contribute in this area? Well, one idea that struck me was, if we think back 15, 20 years ago, one of the major contributions that the OECD made in the area of agriculture was to develop these indices on trade restrictions and subsidies, domestic subsidies, into these metrics, the producer subsidy equivalents, consumer subsidy equivalents, that were then comparable across countries to really help us understand who were the big interveners in agricultural markets and who were not. And then you could look at that and say, let's bring that to the table in terms of policy discussions. Maybe there are certain things that the OECD could be doing to help contribute in this area in terms of creative ways to examine the data on competition, industrial policy engagement that would help shed light on these, I think, really critical areas of international confrontation. My third point is to again highlight the tremendous work that the OECD has done on that last part of the triangle that Kathy showed at the end, which was on the domestic policies. And I agree with her entirely that way too much attention for the key critical adjustment problems that are faced by the United States, Europe, all countries of the world. China is going through this right now, focuses somehow on trade and trade agreements and trade negotiations. It's just not where the problems should be solved. They should be solved through domestic policies. But the question is, what do we do? So here I know that the OECD has done important work to help shed light, especially in cross-country types of examples, examining activist policies that are focused on moving, both, if we're talking about workers, or potentially firms out of declining sectors, right? So trying to adjust economic agents out of economic activity that are no longer productive versus a completely different set of policies which are activist in and she mentioned regional policies, right? That's sort of a bit more industrial policy, but trying to support regions, say, that may have suffered disproportionately from technology shocks, from consumer shocks, even some trade shocks. We don't know a lot there. I think Kathy suggested that the evidence on activist regional policies isn't good, but it seems to me that this is where the debate should be in terms of what governments should be doing. If we're telling them, don't interfere with trade, that's not the right solution to solve these adjustment problems that we're facing. We do need to be able to provide them with better guidance for what they should be doing. And so perhaps in our Q&A in the time that we have left, you can tell us a little bit more out of some of the research that the OECD has done in this area, but also some of the other resources that the OECD might have available for other researchers that are interested in pursuing these types of questions. But thank you.
It's meetings week. I have to get more quick with my microphone switches. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Chad, for a very deep discussion. I will admit I'm going to have to reread Catherine's charts and some of the links to fully appreciate what's going on there. This was admirably research-based, and so we, in addition to webcasting and, of course, we have the transcript today, we will be posting Catherine's PowerPoint with the links on the PIIE website. Should be up by now, probably. I actually agree with Chad. I'd like to pick up exactly where he left off. So you have been involved in the G20 in your role as chief economist of OECD. Where do you think we should go next? And just additionally, I realize this isn't directly out of your work, but given, and I'm glad Chad cited Carolyn's work on this, given the Chinese state-owned enterprise issue being based on her empirical work, very important, but also politically, obviously, critically important, how do you see some of the OECD efforts, OECD-based efforts on tax cooperation, on steel capacity? If you could just say a few words on those kinds of coordination issues.
So on the steel, there is a body within the OECD that has been addressing the steel economies that produce steel, and that body's been in existence for quite some time. It has had a period of time where it was sort of perhaps kind of on the back burner, but we actually were able to get it front and center and endorsed by the G20 in the last communique, as it's called the Global Forum on Steel now, whatever the name was before. It's the Global Forum on Steel. And the objective is to get the data that are necessary in order to sort of be transparent, put on the table who produces what their subsidies are, so that there is an avenue for negotiations. It's one of the few places where we actually have both China and Taiwan in participating. There aren't too many places where you get both of those important players in the same room, and on steel, that is a very important one. I believe that we, by virtue of getting the G20 to endorse the Global Forum on Steel and a timetable to achieve the collecting of the data in order to do the analysis that we do to put back to the Global Forum, that was why we didn't get steel tariffs put on, why the U.S. did not put on steel tariffs. So it was an explicit example of where an international organization working through a international body of governments, meaning the G20, was able to intercede to prevent a damaging bilateral course of action. So I think that the people involved should be very proud about that. And now it's, of course, we have to get the data and we have to get the information, and we only have until November to do it. So people are working very hard. On the tax side, the tax issue is a much broader one. Base erosion profit shifting is, of course, the BEPS is the acronym, and it is designed to ensure that taxes are paid where value is created. And it is an approach to try to deal with what has been a very effective strategy of tax arbitrage on the part of large corporations. Should be no surprise that large corporations take advantage of tax differentials. You put out there different taxes, they arbitrage, this is what they do. And I think it was only when governments woke up to the fact that none of them were getting any tax revenues. I mean, it's like, you getting any? I'm not getting any. Nobody's getting any tax revenues, even those who had the lowest tax rate, which they thought would get them some of the revenues. No, nobody was going to get, none of the governments were getting tax revenues anymore. And so that realization, which again came through the G20 a couple of years ago, that in fact the governments needed to line up on one side of the table vis-a-vis the multinationals. But in the course, in some sense, that's the way it played out. But the point is that that international tax arbitrage was not serving in the interests of any of the governments. So putting in place the BEPS project, which had as its first element a transparency element, automatic exchange of information with regard to individual holdings of wealth offshore in tax havens. There was a couple of issues with regard to data out of Switzerland, Swiss banks, and then LuxLeaks, and then the Panama Papers. These all sort of fed into the automatic exchange of information for individual wealth holdings. But then BEPS being the next stage, which is country-by-country reporting by firms with it to tax authorities across borders, so that there is transparency, at least to the tax authorities, not to other companies, because this is all business strategic information, to tax authorities to ensure that taxes are being paid. Now, there's a bit of a challenge with regard to BEPS now in the pushing within Europe for the turnover tax on digital transactions. And that's going to be an important discussion in the G20 meeting that we're having later this week. That digital taxes is key. Digital was always part of BEPS. It was one of the chapters that was sort of put to the side while kind of like the traditional tax arbitrage was dealt with. But it's clearly come up to the fore, and it needs to be dealt with, obviously, in a cross-border context, because digital transactions are inherently cross-border. So.
Great. No, thank you for taking all that on. I'd like to open it up to our distinguished audience for questions and comment. As usual, please identify yourself when asking a question. The closer it comes to being a question rather than a statement, the longer you can go. And we have a standing mic at back, and Jessica has a traveling mic here. So if you give that gentleman the mic, but first at the back mic.
Thank you. Scott Miller, CSIS. Dr. Mann, thank you for the presentation, and thank you for showing us this amazing trove of data, which is really remarkable. I have a question for the data set. It goes back to, and it's the role of technology per se in reducing trade costs, and that relationship to the slowdown or perhaps reversal in global value chains. Observation would be somewhere around slide 12. You had the chart that showed the global value chain formation and the somewhat flattening of that, and behind the chart were GATT rounds. The implication of that chart is it was the trade policy that drove the change in global value chain formation. Reading Baldwin, I think we've had a period of time since about 1990 where there's been a virtuous cycle. Trade policy has gotten consistently better, or got better through about 2007. At the same time, the information and communication technology revolution made for radical decreases in the cost of coordination. And it was that virtuous combination that really led to the global value chain formation. Now, all technology has diminishing returns. So in the 19th century, the world's fleet of sailing ships converted to steamships. And during that conversion process, globalization actually accelerated as share of, trade as share of global output. But it flattened off. So just a question, can the OECD look at the role of technology isolated from policy as showing those diminishing returns, which frankly would be quite sensible, a sensible at least query. So I look forward to your answer. Thank you.
Good to see you. It's been a while. We can look at changes in technology through the prices of different technology products. And there's certainly a group of people who think that there's been a slowdown in the decline in the price of technology products, and that is a way of explaining the slowdown in trade integration. I would go a little bit in a different direction, which is to show that what matters is not the products themselves, but the application of those products more broadly by other sectors. And so what I would look at in order to address this question is the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index on computer information services. And there are a couple of different ones of those that you can dig into. And so there's quite a range of restrictiveness on that sector alone. And so and there's been a lack of progress on services liberalization in general. When we think about preferential trading agreements, they cherry pick the stuff that isn't important or it isn't challenging, and services is challenging. And so we also have the second round of the Information Technology Agreement, Rev 2, which is supposed to focus on services, but is kind of stuck a little bit. So rather than focus on whether or not prices have continued to decline at the rate that they used to as an indicator, I would look to what extent has trade policy been able to move forward on reducing the restrictiveness when it comes to the application of those services more broadly throughout the product space, so both services and goods.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over here, please.
Hi, John Kitchen, and I thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And Chad, also, I appreciate your comments because a couple echoes, I think, here. One is, what if the growth of integration and value chains ran too fast, too hot in the early to mid-2000s as the world economy and financial boom ran too hot, and the stall after that is kind of returning to what might be a trend? Now, I know that wouldn't be the decline that you showed in the real-time chart, but that's the question for that question. The second one is regarding the benefits to manufacturing exports from service liberalization. What about the effect on the factors of production that underlie those changes, and notably labor? And this kind of echoes a couple of your points, and the question then about, well, what's the domestic policy response? Because you could have an increase in the exports, but the value of output, but labor or the factors of production, it doesn't say anything about the distribution of income effects that would be associated with that. So you could have a situation where labor actually is adversely affected if you have productivity and export relationships integrated and whatnot. So that's kind of the question I wonder about, if you have additional thoughts on that implication. Even if you have the manufacturing export improvements, what does that say about the underlying income distribution issues?
Thank you.
So on the first question, which was, and also good to see you, John. Did sort of global value chains get integrated too quickly, and now we're just sort of seeing a kind of a pause? I don't think the financial market analogy works here, because the deeper integration has a much longer time horizon to it, 86 to 2007. It's not something that was kind of post 95 or post 2000. So I don't think that analogy is quite right. The other factor that I think is relevant here is that bringing to bear some other work that we've done looking at productivity and between different kinds of firms within a sector. There's the leading firms and then there's the lagging firms within each sector. And so when we have, part of the story about why global value chains perhaps have petered out or retrenched is that a set of firms have not been able to participate. And why is that? I said part of the story is services, costly nature of services restrictiveness disproportionately fall on the shoulders of the smaller firms. And so they don't get to participate. And if services liberalization had proceeded along a similar line as goods, then a more broad spectrum of firms would have been able to engage in global value chains, and we would have gotten productivity gains associated with that. Now, this gets to, well, what about the factors of production? What about workers? So this is, again, about adjustment. Adjustment isn't easier or better if you don't have productivity growth. Again, we go to our firm level analysis, and it shows that firms that have not been, firms that are lagging in terms of productivity growth are also the firms that can't pay their workers anything. And it's not good for those workers. They've had no increase in their wages. So holding back productivity growth with somehow this idea that that's going to make it better for workers is really misguided. The adjustment problem is very real, but to say, let's stop the adjustment and then that's better is really not the direction to go. We have to take the adjustment problem head on and come up with better strategies to deal with to deal with how to engage with adjustment. And it's not just paying off people, because we know that that actually is not a successful strategy. It does get us to the point that Chad finished with in his so tell me, what are you doing on coming up with these new strategies? And I got to tell you that this is an area, I'm getting all of the regional people to compile the best practices. We have a set of an initiative called Champion Mayors, which is, an awful lot of stuff happens at the mayoral level. And so the mayors are getting together and it's like, well, how did you deal with some of these adjustments? But we also have to deal with the fact that do you move people out of regions that are declining? Do you prevent regions from declining by catching them before they collapse? Some of this regional analysis where we can, as I say, with the UK analysis which will be coming out in the UK Economic Survey, we do a big thing on each one of our countries every 2 years. Our UK survey will be launched next week. It has a couple of chapters that look at very, very detailed analysis of UK productivity by region, matching firm level data by the region, by the product characteristics, by the employment. So we can really get, if we think we know where some problems are coming from, maybe we can do something before the thing falls apart.
Before Chad responds, I just want to say that what Catherine just said about stalling the productivity and supporting the low productivity firms not leading to the right distributional outcomes, even if you could stop the world and get off, I think is something a lot of us have intuitively felt, but she articulated beautifully, and ideally the OECD does have the research backing that up. If she was a PIIE fellow, I'd be telling her that's what we need a policy brief on right now, and I'm going to take that clip and our people will take that video clip and get it out there. But Chad, I'm sorry, just one more thing on that. It is striking how few people are making that case, that specific case, that if you put up the barriers, you don't actually protect that many jobs, you don't actually protect the income distribution. In the financial sector, Catherine was making the question of what's comparable to the financial sector or not. Nicholas Verone and I, among others, have been, I think, reasonably effective in establishing the idea that if you cut off financial liberalization, you don't necessarily end up with a stable financial system and good outcomes there. But this is on the real side, and we need to make the same case. Chad.
So thank you for that answer. I thought that was fascinating. I think this just points to the other thing that you said in your remarks, which is we really have to be thinking about the heterogeneous policy response. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to this, but what that's going to mean is it's going to be incredibly complicated because a lot of these things are going to have to be directed at the federal level or coordinated through the federal level to make sure that there isn't, competition between mayors, that there is coordination and perhaps the allocation of resources. But I'm heartened by the recognition that this needs to be a micro focused exercise. So thank you. I will also say that I cheated a little bit. I kind of knew that she was going to go in this direction because of her active engagement on Twitter. So we tweet about these types of topics. So if you don't, you should follow her on Twitter.
Before I go to the next question, I need to do a more old-fashioned form of advertising, just to emphasize what Chad said. Chad and Carolyn Freund are doing work for us on this issue of adjustment and what's the right way to think about it, and especially picking up on the issue Catherine raised, that you don't want to just keep locking in these poor people into whether it's Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in Germany or Puerto Rico in the U.S. or wherever in distressed regions. And I'm delighted to announce that the Institute has just received a major grant from the Tides Foundation to support this work. So that's very good news. Please, sir.
Will Martin, Will Martin from IFPRI. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Chad. Great observations. One thing I'm intrigued about, there have been huge changes both in trade flows and the pattern of trade flows and the pattern of policies in agricultural trade. And OECD, as Chad mentioned, does an enormous amount of important work on this. So I just wondered if you had any observations to share on that question.
You got me stumped. Yes, we do a lot of work on agriculture. It is certainly an area where the services and the technology elements are increasingly important, disproportionately applied across countries. So that when we think about using cross-country variation and literally cross-product, meaning different kinds of agricultural products, that there's a very rich data available to get at how technology is being applied and how services liberalization might be an important ingredient to improving the value added to agriculture, particularly in some of the lower income economies that the OECD works with. We're not just the rich country club. We also work with a lot of other countries as well.
Thank you. Please.
I'm Rory McFarker at Google. So you flashed up a very striking slide, quite briefly, showing the increase in restrictions on data flows and various other forms of technological data localization requirements and so on, but didn't fully integrate that into your discussion, for example, of the declining slope of expansion of global value chains. But I mean, in the larger context of your remarks, it looks like far from just trade and services liberalization stalling, it looks like it's actually the imposition of a whole host of brand new restrictions on services trade, and which surely you would expect to have the kind of negative effect on cross-border trade that we may be seeing. So I'd be interested in your reaction to that.
Thank you.
So you are right. That's a very good observation that it could be that these new restrictions are associated with declining trade in information technology, data flows, and that is part of the reason for the declining trade intensity and the retraction of the global value chains. I think that's probably going a little bit too far in the sense that as much as I'm a great believer in cross-border data, I wrote a book for Peterson called Global Electronic Commerce, a Policy Primer, in the year 2000, and all I would need to do is change the copyright date on that to 2017, and the issues that are brought up with regard to data restrictions, then it's remarkable how it's just like deja vu all over again. But I do think, but it's a small, I think this is a small story for what we're seeing now. It is a potentially canary in the coal mine going forward as cross-border data flows could and should become a more important ingredient to overall cross-border trade. Think of it as the Industry 4.0 stuff, where it doesn't matter that you sold a washing machine. What really matters is the data flow associated with the washing machine. All that said, the reason why I showed that diagram was because here's some raw material for research to use and to go at the type of specific focus for how these restrictions could be preventing the type of expansion in cross-border data flows that would be part of expanding global trade.
Chad, do you want to add anything on that topic? Great. So the last question, please.
Bill Klein here at the Institute. Kathy, you had a slide which had a green bar going down, which was the impact of technological change on manufacturing employment. It had a very thin, razor-thin gray bar, a gray slot, which was the impact of, negative impact of imports for final consumption. And it had a positive blue bar, which is imports of intermediate. Well, the message seemed to be that all you folks who are so worried about trade reducing manufacturing jobs, including Autor and Hansen and company, are just wrong. There has been a net increase because these wonderful intermediate products enabled us to produce stuff and put people to work, and otherwise we couldn't have put them to work. I wonder about if I interpreted that correctly, I wonder about the implicit assumption about the ability to produce the intermediates at home. If you take somebody like Adrian Wood, he's going to have just exactly the opposite. He's going to have a calculation that all of these intermediates could have been produced domestically with huge labor requirements. So the broad question is, do you really want us to take away the message that there has been no adverse impact of imports on employment in the U.S. manufacturing sector and not worry about traditional, Stolper Samuelson and so forth because of this liberating supply of otherwise unavailable intermediate products?
So the point to take away from that chart is that the concerns that we have about adjustment in the manufacturing sector, which is a real concern, is driven by changes in technology and changes in consumer preferences. Those dominate the changes associated with trade. That's the bottom line. To say that trade and therefore trade policy is going to solve our adjustment problems, that is wrong. We have a much broader set of policies that are importantly need to be engaged in order to address the adjustment problems that are very real. If you take away the domestic set of instruments and focus only on the trade instruments, you're not using your full policy set and you're not addressing the key area of the dynamic, which is technology and changes consumer preferences.
Great. Well, we're going to close it off there. I obviously am grateful to Catherine Mann and the OECD team and work she represents for joining us today and giving us this insight. I'm grateful to Chad for bringing it back to some of the work we're doing here by him and other colleagues. But most of all, I'm grateful to both of you for continuing to straddle that important divide two important divides: the generation of research questions and policy answers, which don't necessarily synchronize, and the macroeconomic effects and the trade integration, which do clearly interact, but that's a divide in how we think. So thank you for helping us deal with both those divides.
Thank you very much.